All right, so let's give this new setup a try. So today, what I want to talk about is the often thrown out kind of hand-wavy excuse that is given to a lot of people for pretty much the only reason why they succeed, and that is genetics. Good genetics is a very nebulous term that doesn't really have a clear definition. For instance, if we're talking about muscular hypertrophy, does the person have good genetics in terms of number and arrangement of type 2 muscle fibers? Do they have good genetics in terms of, androgen receptors, so that per unit volume they get more out of their testosterone than a regular person does? Do they have good genetics for a specific body part like biceps or calves or lats, right? So when we say good genetics in the context of, specific to muscle, we got to be very specific about what we're talking about. If we're talking about good genetics in terms of specific capacities, having good genetics in one doesn't necessarily mean that you also have good genetics in another one. You might have, for instance, good genetics in explosiveness and rate of force development, so you're a very good jumper or sprinter or thrower, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you'll have equivalently good genetics in an event that requires more muscular endurance, for instance, like an 800. Then, in addition to that, not only could genetics in one category not necessarily mean that you have good genetics in another category, but there are genetic proclivities that perhaps come with a built-in detriment, so that in fact you're really good in one thing, but then that means you're really bad in another thing. There's two examples that come to mind. Myself, for instance, with my particular structure, I have narrow clavicles, long arms and legs. I'm naturally built very well for pulling. First thing I got really good at was deadlifts, rows, pull-ups, things like that. But bench, squat, with my long femurs, I'm terribly structured for that. So you could say I have good deadlift genetics, but if you just said good genetics full stop, not a true statement. Because I actually have crap genetics for benching, squatting, front squatting. Even if you have good genetics, even if we clearly define specifically what we're discussing. So they're like, hey, Sergeant Matt, you have really good conditioning genetics because you're East African. Well, maybe we could say that. However, genetics still require the stimulus to unlock their full potential. Like, you've seen, for instance, you probably have people in your family or in your workplace, or you just see them walking around that you're like, oh man, that guy has good genetics, because like they apparently don't even train, but they have massive calves, or huge forearms, or really thick wrists. Like you're like, man, if that guy trained, he has good genetics, he could be super strong or whatever. So you just think genetics gives you these automatic abilities, right? So for me, with my conditioning, sure, I'm East African. We're kind of known to be good at that. But guess what? For most of my early life, I was an overweight asthmatic kid. Those genetics didn't kick in until I unlocked them by training incessantly in the thing that supposedly it's genetics people say that I'm supposed to be good at automatically. Just because you have a genetic proclivity for something doesn't mean that there's no free lunches, right? Even if you're starting off at a better point than somebody with worse genetics than you in that particular area, you still need to provide a stimulus for that gene transcription to take place so that the full potential of your genetics gets unlocked. The elite of the elite in anything, in athletics, in academia, in business, in whatever, they may start off at a better place than other people, or they may have this like hidden unlocked potential. But at the end of the day, the ones that are really successful at the top of their game, it's they had the genetics, but also they did the work. And that kind of brings me to my last point about genetics, which is regardless of what we're talking about, what specific attribute, proclivity, whatever, genetics is like anything else. It's like wealth, it's like attractiveness, intelligence, anything else, right? Life isn't fair. People start at better or worse positions, but it doesn't necessarily mean that in 2024, that's where you gotta stay. You know, like I said, I started off an overweight asthmatic kid, and now I'm in exceptional shape in my 40s. But that's not because this is how I naturally am. I force this to be the way that I am because this is how I want to be, not because this is just how it is. You can make yourself, bringing it full circle back to athletics, health, physique, whatever it is that we're talking about. You can do whatever you like. You might not ever be as good at basketball as LeBron James, but you could still get pretty good at basketball if you train it. You might not get as good at jiu-jitsu as Gordon Ryan, but you could still practice every day and get pretty freaking good at jiu-jitsu. So don't look at somebody that is extremely successful and then just kind of hand wave it off as like, oh, good genetics, I can never do that. Well, you don't know because you haven't actually tried to do the work to unlock what genetic potential that you have. So my message to those of you that are listening to this, if you feel defeated, if you feel like it's impossible and the fitness community or the beauty standards or the whatever social media blah 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 thing is setting you up for failure because there's all these unrealistic standards, well, who cares? Just train and figure out where your genetic potential is, what you can unlock within yourself. Everybody has some things that they're really good at and really bad at. And particularly when it comes to athletics, most people go through their entire lives never really knowing what that is. Most people grow old and start becoming frail and decrepit before they get anywhere near unlocking their full genetic potential. So before you go and start pointing fingers and saying like, oh, see that? That's just genetics. What are your genetics? What do you have in there that you have yet to unlock? And guess what the key is? Consistent, repeated efforts, training. So, with that said, go and unlock your own genetics by being consistent and stay in the fight.